Tell me what you read as a child, and I'll tell you who you think you are. For generations, classic children's books have been more than mere stories. They've shaped cultural norms, molded values, and constructed a default image of who belongs at the center of a tale. Children's stories offer first glimpses of worlds where good and evil, right and wrong, familiar and foreign are defined. For young readers, these stories don't just entertain. They lay the foundations of their worldview. But who are these stories truly about, and what ideas do they passively reinforce? Many children's books that enjoy iconic status, from fairy tales to modern classics, were crafted in an era when whiteness and Western ideals were the unspoken defaults. The characters in these stories, those who we root for, laugh at, or fear, often carry racial undertones. The mischievous tricksters, the innocent heroes, the misunderstood villains, and the exotic others may be doing more than entertaining. Behind each hero and sidekick, each mythical land and adventure, lies an undercurrent of assumptions about race, identity, and place. Whiteness as the default in children's classics. One of the most enduring figures in American children's literature is a lovable, boundary-pushing cat in a hat. Though not visibly human, the cat embodies qualities coded by race, and his characterization borrows from traditions that included racialized forms of entertainment, like minstrel shows. When The Cat in the Hat was first published in 1957, the United States was amid social upheaval, with racial tensions intensifying as the civil rights movement gained momentum. Yet, while society was re-examining racial stereotypes, children's literature largely remained untouched by these conversations. The Cat in the Hat is one of many characters whose identity reflects a historical moment's prejudices. Though many of Seuss's works also advocate for kindness and tolerance, the cat can be seen as part of a lineage of trickster figures that resonate with tropes about racialized mischief. As we explore this character, it's worth asking, how did we, as readers, come to see this figure as innocuous or even endearing? The trickster archetype. From folklore to the playful cat. The trickster archetype is ancient, rooted in storytelling traditions across cultures. From West African Anansi stories to Brer Rabbit tales brought over by enslaved Africans, trickster figures often symbolize resilience, wit, and cunning as tools for survival. However, these trickster narratives were racialized when repurposed in Western entertainment, evolving into distorted caricatures in vaudeville and blackface minstrelsy. These caricatures reflected prejudices, portraying black characters as comic troublemakers who brought disorder and laughter, but were ultimately contained by society's rules. Dr. Seuss's cat appears to draw from this trickster lineage, embodying a similar role, a figure who disregards the rules, creating chaos for the amusement of two white children, only to retreat back into his own ambiguous world. The cat's mannerisms, dress, and behavior can be understood as subtly echoing the exaggerated traits once associated with minstrel shows, a cultural inheritance that many readers may overlook, but that still informs his presence. How otherness is crafted in classic children's books. Beyond the cat, other characters from this era reveal assumptions about race through subtle narrative cues and visual markers. Consider, for instance, exoticized other figures in tales like Peter Pan or The Jungle Book. In Peter Pan, we encounter the Indians on Neverland, painted as wild, mysterious, and subservient to Peter. These depictions present non-Western characters as symbols of the primitive or as caricatures to contrast with the civilized Western child. This trend doesn't end with early 20th century books. Many later children's classics replicate such depictions in subtler ways. The beloved story of Curious George, for example, tells of a naughty little monkey who is taken from his homeland to live in the city with the man with the yellow hat. Though not explicitly racial, the story evokes themes of colonial exploration and conquest, presenting an indigenous figure, George, the monkey, as a source of comic relief and adventure for a Western civilizer. These books, which seem innocent or amusing at first glance, are part of a legacy of literature that teaches children about the other through biased perspectives. The other is often a figure who can be laughed at, sympathized with, or even pitied, but never fully understood or allowed to be the hero. Whose story is centered, and why? At the heart of our analysis is a simple question. Why are certain characters allowed to drive the narrative, while others serve merely as sidekicks or sources of humor? By centering white or Western figures and marginalizing non-Western or non-white characters, these books reinforce a hierarchy that, consciously or not, children internalize. They see which characters are normal and central, and which are different or peripheral. This storytelling dynamic has long-lasting implications for how children perceive their place in the world, and the value they assign to people who look or act differently from them. The characters in beloved children's books might not wear obvious markers of race, yet they participate in a cultural script that subtly enforces racial dynamics. How many children have noticed that the adventures in Where the Wild Things Are revolve around Max, a white boy whose monsters mirror primitive stereotypes? Or that The Wizard of Oz features characters from other lands, who serve to emphasize the values of a wholesome Midwestern normality, represented by Dorothy? Moving beyond innocent stories, to unpack these narratives is not to tarnish their legacy or question their worth outright, but to recognize that literature has long played a role in reinforcing social hierarchies. When we view children's books through a critical lens, we see that even seemingly benign stories reflect complex assumptions about race, class, and gender. They teach young readers, subtly and powerfully, who they might be and who they are not. As we journey through these classic tales, we'll look at how characterizations of the mischievous, the heroic, and the exotic have shaped ideas of identity. The task isn't simply to condemn beloved stories, but to understand how the narratives we once read without question continue to influence the stories we tell, and the people who read them. The myths of innocence, racial tropes and stereotypes in beloved stories. In every beloved tale, there lies a mirror of society, its values, its fears, and its biases. Innocence is the bedrock of children's literature, a guiding principle that asserts that stories for young readers should be safe, unspoiled by the harsh realities of adult life. Yet beneath this veil of innocence often lie coded messages and stereotypes that reflect societal biases, even if inadvertently. While adults may overlook these biases, young readers absorb them, piecing together an understanding of the world that subtly reinforces social hierarchies. This chapter explores some of the most prevalent racial tropes in children's literature and unpacks the ways they have helped shape attitudes about race, identity, and belonging. The noble savage and the primitive other. One of the earliest and most pervasive tropes in children's literature is the noble savage. From Peter Pan's Red Indians to the Jungle Book's characters, this trope simplifies indigenous people as either noble and pure or wild and dangerous, but always othered and somehow separate from the westernized norm. These characters typically exist as foils to civilized protagonists, enhancing the Western character's sense of bravery, resourcefulness, or compassion. In J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, the Red Indians of Neverland embody a romanticized yet reductive vision of indigenous culture. Tiger Lily and her tribe are portrayed as fierce but simple, courageous yet inherently wild. They serve as a colorful backdrop to Peter and Wendy's adventures, providing a sense of danger but never challenging the supremacy of the story's main, white characters. This depiction leaves young readers with the impression that indigenous people are exotic, mysterious, and ultimately peripheral to the real adventure. Instead of encouraging empathy or understanding, these portrayals solidify a racial hierarchy where indigenous characters exist only to enrich the protagonist's journey. Similarly, in The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling, the jungles of India become a world of civilized and savage dichotomies. Mowgli's story is one of mastering his environment, ultimately rising above the animalistic setting into which he was born. Kipling, writing from a colonial British perspective, romanticized India as a land both fascinating and fearsome, yet ultimately untamable without Western guidance. Mowgli's ability to transcend his jungle upbringing, interacting with creatures who are wild and unpredictable, subtly mirrors the colonial ideal that Western ways of being are inherently superior. The mischievous other, how humor carries prejudice. Humor has always been a powerful tool in children's literature, easing young readers into stories while conveying messages in ways that resonate with them. However, when this humor relies on racial stereotypes, it perpetuates negative biases under the guise of harmless fun. Characters who exist primarily to amuse, especially those based on racial caricatures, reinforce an idea that some individuals are less serious, less central, and by extension, less important. Before entering the story, consider Curious George, the mischievous little monkey brought from Africa by the man with the yellow hat. George's adventures are lighthearted and funny, and readers are encouraged to laugh at his naive, sometimes chaotic misinterpretations of human society. However, the setup, a civilized Western man bringing a monkey from Africa, echoes the troubling dynamic of colonial relationships, where indigenous peoples were often seen as simple or childlike, in need of Western intervention. George is more than a monkey. He's an embodiment of how colonial views reduce the other to a source of amusement or curiosity, rather than acknowledging their humanity or complexity. The absent hero, who gets to save the day? In classic children's stories, heroes are often white, male, and courageous. They are proactive, clever, and resourceful. Qualities that set them apart from other characters who, while sometimes essential, they are never central to the tale. This unspoken hero code teaches readers that certain people, by default, are best suited for adventure and valor. Take The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. The Pevensie siblings, white British children, venture into a magical land where they are immediately cast as saviors. Their whiteness and Britishness are never questioned. They're seen as naturally suited to ruling over Narnia and making decisions for its inhabitants, who include fauns, dwarfs, and centaurs, all creatures of otherness. This dynamic, where the protagonists are seen as inherently heroic due to their Western identity, communicates that leadership, bravery, and valor are natural traits of white, Western figures. Even when books do include non-white characters, these characters are often relegated to supporting roles. In Harry Potter, for example, Hogwarts is diverse, yet the story consistently centers on white protagonists, with characters like Cho Chang, Dean Thomas, and the Patil twins playing minor roles. The heroes and heroines who solve the mysteries and confront the villains are predominantly white. This sends a message to young readers. Adventure and heroism belong primarily to white characters, while diversity is relegated to the periphery. Color coding and the connotations of good and bad. In countless stories, good and bad are symbolically coded through color and physical appearance, an implicit message that impacts children's perceptions of beauty and morality. From the wicked stepmothers and dark forests of fairy tales to the color-coded villains and heroes of modern classics, children are subtly taught that dark is dangerous and light is good. For example, in many classic fairy tales, evil characters are cloaked in dark colors or have darker skin tones, while good characters like princesses and heroes are fair-skinned and light-haired. In Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent's dark attire and ominous aura emphasize her role as the villain, while Aurora's fair beauty symbolizes innocence and purity. Even outside of explicit racial commentary, this symbolism reinforces associations that tie darkness to danger and lightness to safety and goodness. In The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, the orcs, representing evil and darkness, are portrayed as dark-skinned, brutish, and ugly. In contrast, the fair-skinned elves are elegant, wise, and good, fighting on the side of righteousness. Such portrayals, even if not explicitly racial, draw on associations that reinforce negative biases against those who look different from the Western ideal. A lasting legacy, the impact of these tropes. These racial tropes and stereotypes may seem minor on the surface, but their impact is far-reaching. When children read stories in which characters of color are the sidekicks, the mischievous others, or the exotic obstacles, they internalize messages about their place in society. For children of color, this often means seeing themselves as the other, on the fringes of the story, rarely in the spotlight. For white children, it reinforces the idea that they are the default or normal protagonists, destined to be the center of every adventure. Even seemingly innocent tropes have the power to influence young minds, shaping a worldview where certain people are deemed more worthy, more capable, and more human than others. These messages linger long after the books are closed, affecting how children grow up to understand race, identity, and worth. In this way, children's literature doesn't merely entertain, it educates, for better or worse, subtly instilling values and hierarchies that influence generations. Reimagining childhood stories. Revisiting these beloved classics with a critical eye doesn't mean discarding them. Rather, it offers an opportunity to reimagine stories where every child sees themselves as a hero. By consciously analyzing these tropes and fostering a new generation of inclusive, nuanced literature, we can reshape the landscape of children's books to reflect the diversity and complexity of the world children actually inhabit. Beyond the margins, whose childhoods are visible? In every story, someone is visible and someone is missing. The question is, who and why? If childhood is meant to be a time of wonder and exploration, a time for stories that inspire dreams and shape identities, then who gets to experience it fully in the books we read? Children's literature has long been one of society's most influential tools for nurturing young imaginations. But when we examine its history, a troubling pattern emerges. Many children, particularly those from marginalized communities, remain invisible, their stories untold, their perspectives overlooked. In this chapter, we'll examine whose childhoods have historically been erased or sidelined in children's literature and why it matters. The invisible child, the systematic erasure of diverse childhoods. Historically, children's books have largely centered on white, middle to upper-class protagonists, often boys, with limited representation of girls or children of different races, religions, or abilities. This narrow focus stems from cultural and industry biases that treat white male childhoods as the universal experience, relegating others to the periphery or excluding them altogether. By focusing almost exclusively on these identities, children's literature has rendered countless young readers invisible. Consider some of the best-known characters from children's books: Peter Pan, Huckleberry Finn, Harry Potter, Tom Sawyer. Each has become an icon of a typical childhood experience. Yet these characters share a set of features: white, adventurous, resourceful, that reinforce a singular vision of childhood as inherently white and predominantly male. In shaping this vision, the industry has, either consciously or unconsciously, erased the lived experiences of children from minority communities. Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx children, as well as those with disabilities, are largely absent or, at best, reduced to secondary characters whose roles are supportive, tokenized, or stereotyped. For generations, young readers from these backgrounds have had few reflections of their lives or experiences on the pages of the books they read. This invisibility creates a vacuum, one where many children may question their place in the world or feel they do not belong in the central narrative of life. Universal narratives and the narrowing of childhood experience. The notion of universal narratives has been one of the primary rationalizations for the narrow representation in children's books. For many publishers, authors, and educators, the idea of universal themes, friendship, bravery, curiosity, kindness, has often meant prioritizing stories about white children, assuming that all children can relate to their experiences. But this assumption ignores how different cultural contexts shape these experiences uniquely, making it unrealistic and unjust to expect all children to see themselves in a limited, homogeneous set of stories. In Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, for instance, the March sisters deal with themes of family, friendship, and personal growth, all of which resonate with readers of various backgrounds. However, the story is still rooted in a distinctly white, middle-class American setting that reflects specific social values and expectations. Young readers from marginalized backgrounds may not find a clear reflection of their own lives in stories like these, even if they admire the characters or relate to some of their struggles. While books like Little Women are valuable for the themes they explore, they become problematic when they are upheld as the primary or universal models of childhood, crowding out the chance for diverse experiences to be celebrated. The harmful implications of absence. The lack of visibility in children's literature has tangible effects on children from marginalized backgrounds. Psychologists have found that children internalize ideas about identity and belonging at a young age, often shaped by the media and stories they encounter. When a child sees only white, able-bodied, middle-class protagonists in their books, they may come to believe that they are somehow lesser, or that their life experiences are not important enough to be told. This absence also affects white children, who grow up without exposure to diverse perspectives. When stories are homogeneous, they fail to foster empathy for those outside the majority experience. White children reading only stories about characters who look like them are less likely to understand or relate to the experiences of peers from different racial, cultural, or socioeconomic backgrounds. This lack of exposure may contribute to prejudice, ignorance, or even fear of those perceived as different. The rare exceptions: early voices in diverse storytelling. While the majority of children's literature remained narrow in focus for much of the 20th century, a few pioneering authors and illustrators sought to break these boundaries. Ezra Jack Keats's The Snowy Day, published in 1962, is often celebrated as one of the first mainstream children's books to feature a black protagonist, Peter, in a simple, everyday story about playing in the snow. Keats, who was a white author, defied the norms of the time by choosing to portray a black child as the main character of an otherwise ordinary story. This choice was revolutionary, challenging the industry's perception that only white children could occupy the center of children's narratives. Similarly, Virginia Hamilton's novels, such as M.C. Higgins' The Great, provided nuanced portrayals of African American children, depicting their struggles and triumphs with depth and complexity. Hamilton's work showed that children's literature could move beyond stereotypes and authentically represent black childhoods, paving the way for future authors to tell diverse stories. Despite these trailblazing works, however, the mainstream market remained overwhelmingly homogeneous for decades. Keats's and Hamilton's contributions were celebrated but seen as exceptions rather than the start of a movement. Their success demonstrated that diverse stories could resonate with readers, Yet the industry hesitated to invest in stories that didn't fit the mold. It would take further advocacy, research, and persistence to open up the field more fully to diverse voices. The role of the publishing industry in enforcing boundaries. The publishing industry has played a significant role in perpetuating the narrow focus of children's literature. For years, publishing executives have favored stories by white authors featuring white characters, operating under the assumption that these books would be more marketable and profitable. Many publishing houses also lack diversity among their staff, resulting in a lack of understanding of or commitment to diverse narratives. This homogeneity at every level, from editorial boards to marketing teams, further entrenched the focus on a narrow range of experiences. In recent years, organizations such as We Need Diverse Books have spotlighted the systemic issues within the publishing industry and advocated for more inclusive stories and creators. The goal is not just to feature more children of color in stories, but also to empower authors from diverse backgrounds to tell their own narratives, drawing on their unique cultural contexts and experiences. By amplifying the voices of authors and illustrators who reflect a wide range of identities, the industry can begin to remedy the erasure that has long defined it. The power of representation. How stories can transform childhood. Representation matters profoundly in children's literature. When young readers see themselves reflected in stories, they gain confidence, empathy, and a sense of belonging. Books become mirrors that affirm their worth and existence, helping them to see their culture, background, and identity as valuable. This visibility can be life-changing, especially for children from marginalized backgrounds who have historically been left out of the narrative. At the same time, inclusive literature also serves as a window for all readers, providing insights into experiences and lives different from their own. When stories portray children from diverse backgrounds as heroes, adventurers, and dreamers, they foster an environment where empathy, understanding, and inclusivity become natural values. For children from the majority, these stories act as gateways to new perspectives, challenging assumptions and building connections. Expanding the canon of childhood. As we continue to explore the absence and erasure of certain childhood experiences in children's literature, it's clear that a single narrow vision of childhood does not and should not define the genre. Every child deserves to see themselves as central to a story, not just as a sidekick or a token figure. By broadening the canon to include stories from all walks of life, we can create a world of literature that truly reflects the diversity of childhood experiences. The challenge before us is not only to recognize these gaps, but also to demand change within the industry, classrooms, and homes where these books are read. Only by expanding our definitions of what it means to be a child, and whose stories are worth telling, can we hope to create a world where every young reader feels seen, valued, and empowered. Illustrating difference. The power and pitfalls of visual representation in children's books. In a picture book, every line, color, and character design tells its own story. In children's literature, pictures and text work in tandem, with illustrations often becoming a child's first encounter with visual storytelling. Through images, children learn to interpret, identify, and empathize with characters. Yet for much of publishing history, illustrations have not only reinforced, but also exacerbated the racial, cultural, and social biases embedded in children's books. By exploring visual representation, from early caricatures to today's efforts at diverse, authentic imagery, this chapter will analyze how illustrations shape young readers' understanding of identity and the world around them. Early caricatures and the foundations of stereotyping. The history of illustrated children's books reveals a legacy of racial caricatures and simplified visual cues that associate certain races with specific, often demeaning traits. In early children's books, characters of color, if included at all, were frequently drawn using exaggerated features, wide noses, large lips, and dark skin tones that evoked minstrel stereotypes. These depictions created an immediate association between certain races and negative attributes, reducing characters of color to visual punchlines rather than multi-dimensional figures. One such example is Helen Bannerman's The Story of Little Black Sambo, published in 1899, which presents a young Indian boy with dark skin and exaggerated features. Although the story's intent may have been to portray an adventurous and clever child, the illustrations relied on visual stereotypes that dehumanized Sambo and embedded damaging racial connotations into the narrative. This story became emblematic of how illustrations in children's books often served to other non-white characters, using racial exaggerations that turned children of color into spectacles rather than relatable figures. The visual stereotypes in early children's literature were not limited to Black characters. Asian, Indigenous, and Latinx characters were also often depicted in reductive, stereotypical ways, either exoticized, infantilized, or portrayed as mystical others. These illustrations emphasized difference over relatability, reducing characters to foreign caricatures that communicated to young readers that these groups existed outside the norm of the white, Western protagonist. Subtle stereotyping, modern visual cues, and implicit bias. As children's literature evolved, so did its visual language. Explicit caricatures began to disappear from mainstream publications, but implicit biases continued to shape character design. In many cases, illustrators relied on subtler cues to convey difference, often by dressing characters in traditional or stereotypical attire, depicting them with unique skin tones, or placing them in exotic settings. While such elements may seem harmless, they can reinforce the notion that non-white characters are fundamentally different from their white counterparts, even when these characters occupy supportive or positive roles. For instance, consider the character of Tiki Tiki Tembo in Arlene Mosel's book of the same name. Although published in 1968, the illustrations echo earlier depictions of Chinese culture as distant and strange, with exaggerated settings and dress that emphasize the foreignness of the character. This portrayal, coupled with a humorous tone, subtly teaches children that Chinese names, clothing, and customs are funny or unusual, reinforcing an othering effect. Similarly, the tendency to depict Black, Latinx, and Native characters in traditional dress, even in modern stories, can unconsciously frame them as belonging to the past or as static representations of their cultures, rather than as dynamic characters with evolving contemporary identities. Such design choices subtly reinforce outdated views about identity, leaving children with limited, often biased perceptions of other cultures and communities. The role of color, body language, and backgrounds in visual storytelling. The power of visual representation extends beyond character design. Color choice, body language, and background settings all play a role in conveying messages about identity, power, and place. These visual elements, while subtle, often convey implicit biases and reinforce the centrality of whiteness and Western ideals. For example, in many illustrated books, characters from white or Western backgrounds are given greater visual prominence. They're drawn with expressive faces, dynamic poses, and rich detail, while characters from marginalized backgrounds are often simplified or pushed to the background. In books where children of color are secondary characters, illustrators may use muted colors, less distinctive features, or restrained body language, subconsciously teaching readers to view them as peripheral. Backgrounds, too, contribute to the visual coding of difference. Characters in foreign settings are often drawn in barren deserts, lush jungles, or ancient temples, while Western protagonists are placed in relatable, familiar settings like neighborhoods, schools, or houses. These visual contexts reinforce ideas of us versus them, associating Western lifestyles with normalcy and non-Western lifestyles with exoticism or otherness. The new wave of representation, moving toward authenticity. Over the past 2 decades, illustrators and authors have made significant strides toward creating authentic, nuanced depictions of diversity. Contemporary illustrators like Christian Robinson, Yui Morales, and Kadir Nelson have broken new ground by developing rich, detailed visuals that honor the complexity of their characters' identities and experiences. These illustrators bring cultural specificity and depth to their work, moving beyond tokenism to craft representations that resonate with children across diverse backgrounds. In Robinson's Last Stop on Market Street, the illustrations feature a vibrant, multicultural community with distinct and dynamic characters. The story centers on a Black boy and his grandmother, and Robinson's use of bold colors, expressive faces, and a textured, urban setting convey warmth, joy, and community. Rather than relying on caricature or stereotype, Robinson's illustrations celebrate a Black child's journey, offering readers a beautifully detailed and authentic visual narrative. Similarly, in Dreamers, Yui Morales uses intricate designs inspired by Mexican folk art to tell a story of immigration, resilience, and cultural pride. Morales' illustrations reflect her cultural heritage with reverence and affection, offering readers a visually stunning narrative that doesn't reduce Mexican culture to simplistic or stereotypical imagery. Through her art, Morales challenges the traditional visual language of children's literature, inviting readers to see cultural difference as something beautiful, complex, and worthy of exploration. The impact of inclusive illustrations on young readers. When young readers encounter illustrations that reflect their identities and experiences authentically, they gain a sense of validation and pride. Seeing a character who looks like them, portrayed in a positive and relatable way, tells children that their stories matter and that they belong in the world of literature. These visual affirmations can have profound effects on a child's self-esteem, identity formation, and sense of worth. For white or majority group children, inclusive illustrations expand their understanding of the world, helping them appreciate and empathize with perspectives different from their own. By seeing characters of different races, ethnicities, and backgrounds depicted as equals, sharing the same adventures, facing the same struggles, children learn to respect and value diversity. This empathy, cultivated through diverse visual storytelling, has the potential to break down stereotypes and foster a more inclusive mindset from an early age. Beyond tokenism, the need for illustrator diversity. Achieving authentic representation in children's literature requires more than just diverse characters. It demands diverse creators. Illustrators from marginalized backgrounds bring unique insights, cultural knowledge, and artistic perspectives that enrich the stories they tell. Without their voices, visual representation risks falling back on superficial or stereotypical portrayals. Organizations like We Need Diverse Books and the Society of Illustrators have begun advocating for greater diversity among illustrators, encouraging publishers to seek out artists from various racial, cultural, and socioeconomic backgrounds. By prioritizing diversity among illustrators, the industry can create space for authentic visual storytelling, enabling young readers to see themselves and others reflected honestly and respectfully. Toward a new visual language in children's books. As we envision the future of children's literature, it's essential to move beyond the constraints of traditional visual tropes and stereotypes. Illustrators have the power to redefine how we portray childhood, race, and identity, shifting away from outdated symbols of difference and moving toward images that celebrate the richness of human experience. By fostering a new visual language, one that values inclusivity, authenticity, and empathy, we can transform children's literature into a space where all children feel seen, valued, and inspired. Illustrations are more than decorative elements. They are storytellers in their own right. And with every line, every color, and every character design, illustrators have the power to shape how children see themselves, each other, and the world. The journey toward inclusive visual storytelling has begun, but there is much work left to do. By supporting illustrators who champion diversity and encouraging publishers to prioritize authentic representation, we can ensure that every child finds a piece of their world within the pages of a book. Beyond the bookshelf, parents, educators, and the power of intentional storytelling. Every bookshelf is a door to new worlds. The question is, whose stories are waiting on the other side? For young readers, books offer a portal to different lives, perspectives, and possibilities, helping them build a sense of self and empathy for others. Yet, for these lessons to take root, the adults around them, parents, teachers, and librarians, must play an active role in curating the books they encounter and guiding their understanding. This chapter explores how intentional storytelling, through thoughtful selection, discussion, and engagement with diverse literature, can shape children's perceptions of the world and themselves. It offers practical approaches to creating a reading culture that celebrates diversity, encourages critical thinking, and fosters inclusive values. Building an inclusive bookshelf, strategies for diverse book selection. Creating an inclusive bookshelf goes beyond simply adding books with diverse characters. It involves thoughtfully selecting stories that represent a range of experiences, cultures, and perspectives. Diversity in literature includes not only racial and ethnic representation, but also encompasses stories about gender identity, disabilities, socioeconomic backgrounds, family structures, and more. When adults curate bookshelves with care, they provide children with a more accurate and rich understanding of the world. Key strategies for building a diverse bookshelf. Look for own voices stories. Books written by authors who share the same identity as their characters, known as own voices stories, often provide richer, more nuanced depictions of culture and identity. These authors bring authenticity to their narratives, drawing on personal experiences to create characters and settings that feel real and respectful. Include a range of genres, incorporating diverse stories across genres. Fantasy, historical fiction, contemporary fiction, and nonfiction helps children see diversity in all aspects of life, from magical worlds to real-life events. A well-rounded bookshelf normalizes diversity across contexts, showing children that heroes, adventurers, and role models come in many forms. Seek out global perspectives. Stories set in different countries or written by international authors expand children's understanding of cultural diversity beyond their own community. For example, books like A Different Pond by Bao Fi which tells a Vietnamese-American family's story, or My Name is Sangual by Karen Lynn Williams about a Sudanese refugee, offer young readers glimpses into lives that may be unlike their own, yet share universal themes of family, resilience, and hope. Choose books that challenge stereotypes. When selecting books, look for characters who defy stereotypes and whose stories go beyond simple cultural markers. Avoid stories that rely on one-dimensional portrayals, opting instead for books where diverse characters lead dynamic lives, showcase their unique strengths, and face real challenges. Books like El Defo by Cece Bell, a graphic novel about a young girl with hearing loss, or The Stars Beneath Our Feet by David Barclay Moore, featuring a black boy navigating life in Harlem, provide children with multifaceted, relatable characters. Regularly update and rotate the bookshelf. Diversity in children's literature is an evolving field, with new books and voices emerging every year. Adults should regularly update bookshelves to reflect contemporary stories and new perspectives, keeping children engaged with fresh narratives that mirror our changing world. Fostering discussions, creating a space for questions and curiosity. While building an inclusive bookshelf is essential, engaging children in meaningful discussions about these books is just as important. Books can introduce complex topics, such as race, gender, family structures, and cultural traditions, that spark questions in young readers. When adults encourage open, thoughtful discussions, they help children process these ideas, deepening their understanding and empathy. Guiding discussions on diverse literature. Ask open-ended questions. Encourage children to reflect on what they've read by asking questions like, how did the character feel in that situation? Or, what would you have done differently? This allows children to explore characters' perspectives and relate to their experiences on a personal level. Make connections to real life. When discussing books that deal with cultural or social themes, relate them to real-life contexts. For example, after reading a story about immigration, you might talk about the diversity in your own community, or share stories of family history. Making these connections helps children see literature as a reflection of the world around them. Explore feelings of difference and belonging. Stories about characters who feel different or marginalized can provide valuable opportunities for children to reflect on their own experiences with belonging or difference. By discussing these themes openly, adults can help children build empathy and learn to value uniqueness in themselves and others. Address difficult questions with honesty. Children may ask challenging questions about race, identity, or inequality. Rather than avoiding these topics, adults should answer with honesty, using age-appropriate language. A book like Something Happened in Our Town by Marianne Solano, which addresses racial injustice, may prompt difficult questions, but these conversations can serve as a foundation for lifelong empathy and awareness. Encourage critical thinking. Teach children to analyze books critically by asking questions like, who is telling this story? Or, do you think this story could be told in a different way? This approach helps young readers recognize that stories are shaped by perspective and encourages them to seek out diverse viewpoints. Creating a culturally responsive reading environment. In addition to building diverse bookshelves and engaging in meaningful discussions, creating a culturally responsive reading environment is essential for fostering an inclusive mindset. This environment values all backgrounds and experiences, making children feel safe and empowered to explore books that may be outside their own identity. For educators, librarians, and parents, creating this environment means actively normalizing diversity as a part of everyday reading. Practical steps for a culturally responsive reading environment. Display books that reflect diversity, year-round. Avoid limiting diverse books to certain months or events. Instead, make them a regular part of your reading rotation. Featuring books about diverse holidays, such as Oscar and the 8 Blessings for Hanukkah or Ramadan Moon, alongside traditional Western holidays, helps normalize different cultural celebrations. Incorporate literature into broader lessons. Educators can integrate books into lessons on history, geography, and social studies, using diverse stories to highlight different cultures, countries, and historical events. For example, pairing Malala's Magic Pencil by Malala Yousafzai with lessons on activism can inspire young readers to understand and appreciate global struggles for human rights. Create a welcoming, inclusive space. In classrooms and libraries, diverse visual representations, such as posters, artwork, and materials that showcase characters of different races, abilities, and cultures, reinforce a welcoming environment for all students. By making diversity visible, adults signal to children that their identities are valued. Model inclusive language. When discussing books, use inclusive language that celebrates differences and reinforces respect. For instance, describe characters by their strengths and qualities rather than by stereotypical attributes, and be mindful of phrasing that could reinforce biases. Modeling respectful language encourages children to adopt a similar approach when interacting with diverse perspectives. Empowering children as advocates for diversity. As children grow more comfortable with diverse literature, they can be empowered to become advocates for inclusivity within their own circles. Teaching them to actively seek out and recommend books that represent different perspectives helps reinforce the value of diversity as a lifelong pursuit. Ways to encourage advocacy in young readers. Encourage book recommendations. Have children recommend diverse books to friends, classmates, or family members. Giving them a voice in sharing stories they enjoy helps normalize diverse literature in peer groups and empowers them to promote inclusivity. Promote diverse book clubs or reading groups. In classrooms or communities, adults can create reading groups centered on diverse stories, inviting children to discuss and share their thoughts with peers. These groups can offer a space for children to learn from each other's perspectives and deepen their understanding of the importance of diverse voices. Support creative responses to literature. After reading, encourage children to express their responses through art, writing, or discussion. Activities like drawing favorite scenes, writing alternative endings, or creating character diaries foster engagement and allow children to reflect on what diversity means to them personally. Celebrate stories that reflect their own identities. Children from marginalized backgrounds should be encouraged to explore stories that reflect their experiences and to celebrate these narratives. When children feel that their stories are celebrated, they are more likely to advocate for diversity and inclusivity as they grow, building a foundation for a more inclusive future. When adults are intentional about storytelling, selecting diverse books, fostering thoughtful discussions, and creating welcoming spaces, they empower children to view literature as a tool for understanding and celebrating the richness of human experience. This foundation helps children develop empathy, awareness, and respect for others, nurturing an inclusive mindset that they carry into adulthood. Through intentional storytelling, parents, educators, and librarians have the opportunity to make children's literature a catalyst for a more equitable and understanding world. The journey toward inclusivity begins with a single book, but it's strengthened by the guidance and encouragement of the adults who read alongside young readers. By fostering an intentional and inclusive reading culture, we open the door for children to discover not only the world, but also their place within it. A new chapter. Building an inclusive future in children's literature. The stories we tell today shape the world we'll see tomorrow. As children's literature continues to evolve, so does its potential to represent a more inclusive and interconnected world. In recent years, authors, illustrators, publishers, and advocates have made significant strides in expanding the stories available to young readers. Diverse characters and narratives, once exceptions in the children's book industry, are becoming more prevalent, reflecting a broader range of human experiences and perspectives. This chapter explores the efforts within the industry to build a future where every child's story is celebrated, the challenges that remain, and the role readers and advocates can play in shaping this future. The publishing industry's push for inclusivity. The movement toward inclusivity in children's literature began as a grassroots effort, with authors, illustrators, and educators calling for representation that mirrors the diversity of today's world. Organizations such as We Need Diverse Books, established in 2014, have brought attention to the need for books that reflect all identities, whether racial, cultural, gendered, or based on ability and family structure. This movement has since gained traction within the publishing industry, with major publishing houses launching imprints and initiatives dedicated to diverse storytelling. Key changes within the industry. Increased representation among creators. A growing number of authors and illustrators from historically marginalized backgrounds are finding a place in the industry, bringing authentic perspectives and culturally rich narratives to children's literature. With authors like Jacqueline Woodson, Jason Reynolds, and Grace Lynn, readers are experiencing worlds crafted by creators who share cultural and lived experiences with their characters. Expanding access to diverse books. Publishers are working to make diverse books more accessible by promoting them to schools, libraries, and communities. Partnerships between publishers, educational organizations, and nonprofits have led to initiatives that distribute inclusive literature to schools, providing children with direct access to a variety of narratives. Recognition of diverse literature through awards. The industry's commitment to inclusivity is further evidenced by the establishment of awards that celebrate diverse voices. Honors such as the Coretta Scott King Award, the Pura Belpré Award, and the Stonewall Book Award recognize excellence in children's literature by and about underrepresented groups, amplifying voices that may otherwise be overlooked. Challenges to overcome: tokenism and market pressures. Despite significant progress, the journey toward genuine inclusivity in children's literature faces ongoing challenges. Tokenism, the superficial inclusion of diverse characters without meaningful exploration of their identities, remains an issue. Some publishers, pressured by market demand, may prioritize diversity as a selling point without fully committing to thoughtful, nuanced storytelling. Characters from marginalized backgrounds risk being added for the sake of representation rather than for their depth and authenticity. In addition, economic pressures continue to affect which books are published and promoted. Publishers may prioritize stories that fit established narratives or that promise mass market appeal, potentially sidelining stories with deeper cultural specificity or unconventional themes. Advocates within the industry, from editors to marketers, play a critical role in challenging these norms and ensuring that diverse books are not only published, but also marketed with intention and care. Reimagining storytelling, authenticity, depth, and nuance. The next step in building an inclusive future for children's literature involves moving beyond surface-level diversity and fostering narratives that celebrate the depth and richness of varied identities. Authors are embracing the complexities of identity, exploring themes like intersectionality, resilience, and self-acceptance. By depicting characters who are multidimensional, heroes, artists, thinkers, and adventurers, authors and illustrators are challenging stereotypes and celebrating the diversity of human experience. Books like Front Desk by Kelly Yang, which tells the story of a Chinese-American girl's immigrant experience, or The Pants Project by Kat Clark, which explores gender identity and self-discovery, exemplify this shift. Such books offer readers a window into diverse lives while highlighting universal themes of courage, friendship, and self-acceptance. As these books reach young readers, they help children from marginalized backgrounds see themselves as central to their own narratives and invite readers from all backgrounds to explore complex social themes through literature. This reimagined storytelling approach empowers young readers to see their world and themselves with more compassion, empathy, and understanding. The role of readers, educators, and advocates in supporting diverse literature. The success of inclusive literature relies on the readers, educators, and advocates who champion these books in homes, classrooms, and communities. When readers actively seek out and support diverse books, they help shape the market for inclusive literature, creating demand for stories that represent a full range of identities. Parents, teachers, and librarians can amplify this impact by promoting diverse books, organizing inclusive reading programs, and encouraging thoughtful discussions around diverse narratives. Readers have the power to advocate for inclusivity in many ways. Support diverse authors and publishers. Buying books by diverse authors, recommending them to others, and requesting them at libraries all contribute to the visibility of these works. Engage with stories critically. Teaching children to think critically about the books they read fosters a deeper understanding of identity and representation. Encouraging children to question, reflect, and discuss diverse literature helps them appreciate its value. Advocate for diverse books in schools and libraries. Parents, educators, and community members can support diversity in local libraries and school curricula by advocating for the inclusion of diverse titles. This ensures that children from all backgrounds can access stories that reflect their identities. Toward a world of storytelling without boundaries. As we close the final chapter, it's clear that children's literature is at a turning point, one where storytelling has the potential to break boundaries and unite young readers across cultures, experiences, and backgrounds. Inclusive literature isn't merely an addition to the bookshelf. It is a transformative force that reshapes how children see themselves, others, and the world they inhabit. Looking back on the history of children's literature, it's impossible not to feel both a sense of sorrow and hope. Sorrow for the generations of young readers who grew up without seeing themselves reflected in the stories they loved, and hope for the generations to come, who will find mirrors, windows, and doors within the pages of inclusive, diverse books. My reflections on this journey reinforce one truth. When children feel seen and valued, they grow up to see and value others. Through every carefully crafted character, every authentic narrative, and every thoughtfully illustrated page, we are moving closer to a world where all children can find a piece of themselves in the stories they read. But our work is not done. To reach this future, we must continue advocating for, creating and supporting books that break down stereotypes, celebrate uniqueness, and connect us through our shared humanity. My advice to parents, educators, and readers. To build a truly inclusive bookshelf, choose books with intention, seeking out stories that reflect the richness of human experience. Support authors and illustrators from diverse backgrounds and make space for their voices. Encourage young readers to explore different cultures, experiences, and perspectives with an open mind and heart. Each book you place in a child's hands, each conversation you initiate around diversity and empathy, brings us closer to a future where every story matters. Above all, remember that storytelling is a powerful tool for change. By championing inclusive literature, you are helping shape a world where every child feels valued, every child sees themselves as the hero, and every child knows that their story is worth telling. Please subscribe to help TMY Stories reach 1,000 subscribers. Thank you for watching the story. If you find the video interesting and meaningful, please comment 0 and subscribe to the channel TMY Stories. We will bring many interesting and meaningful stories to our audience. Once again, thank you everyone for listening.